It is the 11th of December, 1944, somewhere east of Bastogne, and a German intelligence officer is crouched over a captured document by torchlight. It is not a battle order. It is not a list of troop dispositions. It is a map, and the man studying it is furious because the Americans who drew it have somehow rendered a stretch of the Ardennes forest with a precision his own Wehrmacht cartographers have never managed, despite 4 years of occupying the ground he is now trying to defend. Every contour line sits where it should. Every stream, every farm track, every patch of soft ground that will swallow a half-track to its axles has been marked, measured, and dated. He has spent the war fighting men in Sherman tanks and flying thunderbolts overhead. Now he is beginning to understand that the machine he should have feared most never fired a shot. This is not an isolated grumble from one frustrated officer. Across the European theater, from the beaches of Normandy to the forests of the Hurtgen and the frozen roads of the Ardennes, German commanders repeatedly found themselves outmaneuvered not because American armor was superior, and it frequently was not, but because American commanders knew the ground in a way the Germans simply could not match. Tanks can be destroyed and rebuilt. Divisions can be reinforced. But an army that does not know where the enemy is going to be and does not know the ground well enough to predict it is an army fighting half-blind. By the winter of 1944, the United States Army had built a mapping and terrain intelligence apparatus so thorough, so fast, and so precise that it amounted to a quiet revolution in how modern war was fought, one that has been almost entirely overshadowed by the tanks, the aircraft, and the guns that get all the attention in the history books. To understand why a folded piece of paper could matter more than 50 tons of steel, you first have to understand just how badly the war had been fought, on both sides, by armies that did not really know where they were. Military cartography in 1939 was, by modern standards, a patchwork of guesswork dressed up as science. The maps available to most combatant armies at the outbreak of the Second World War were often decades old, based on surveys conducted before the First World War, sometimes stitched together from civilian tourist maps, railway company charts, and whatever local surveys happened to exist. Roads had been rerouted, villages had grown or vanished, rivers had changed course. None of this mattered enormously in static, trench-bound warfare, where a single sector might be fought over for months and local knowledge accumulated through simple repetition. It mattered enormously once armies began moving 50, 80, 100 kilometers in a matter of days, which is precisely what happened from 1940 onward. A tank column advancing at speed through unfamiliar terrain, relying on a map that misplaced a bridge by half a kilometer or failed to note that a supposedly firm meadow turned to bog after autumn rain, could lose more time and more vehicles to bad cartography than to enemy fire. The Wehrmacht, for all its reputation for operational brilliance, suffered from this problem chronically. German mapping relied heavily on pre-war European surveys and on whatever material could be seized from occupied territories, which meant quality varied enormously from region to region and was almost always months or years out of date by the time it reached a unit in the field. Worse, German military intelligence, and in particular the branch responsible for assessing enemy dispositions in the East, Fremde Heere Ost, was chronically under-resourced when it came to systematic terrain analysis, spending most of its energy on order-of-battle guesswork rather than the patient, unglamorous work of surveying ground. In the West, German commanders found themselves fighting in territory they had occupied for 4 years, yet still did not fully understand, because occupation is not the same as reconnaissance, and garrison duty does not produce updated maps. The United States Army, arriving late to the war but determined not to repeat the mistakes of 1917 and 1918, approached the problem differently, and did so with a resource advantage that would prove decisive. Rather than relying on inherited European surveys, American planners built an entirely new mapping infrastructure from the ground up, one designed specifically for the demands of fast-moving mechanized warfare, and one that treated terrain intelligence not as an afterthought, but as a weapon in its own right. The organization at the heart of this effort was the Army Map Service, based in Washington, working in close coordination with the Corps of Engineers and, crucially, with squadrons of photographic reconnaissance aircraft flying constant sorties over enemy territory. The process began with aerial photography, often flown by modified Spitfires and later by American aircraft equipped with high-resolution cameras capable of capturing ground detail from altitudes of 6,000 meters or more. These photographs were not simply pretty pictures of the landscape below. They were raw data, fed into a process called photogrammetry, in which overlapping images taken from slightly different angles were analyzed stereoscopically, essentially viewed through a device that tricked the human eye into perceiving depth, allowing cartographers to measure elevation, slope, and terrain features with an accuracy that ground survey alone could never achieve at speed. Imagine trying to build an accurate three-dimensional model of a landscape using only 2 flat photographs and a pair of magnifying lenses, and doing it well enough that an artillery officer could calculate a firing solution from the result. That, in essence, was the daily work of the photogrammetric technicians attached to the Army Map Service, and by 1944 they had turned it into an industrial process. Roughly comparable to how a modern factory turns raw steel into finished components on a continuous line, aerial photographs came in, and finished, printed, gridded maps went out, often within days rather than the months such work would have taken a decade earlier. The scale of production was extraordinary. By the time of the Normandy landings, American mapping units, working alongside British counterparts, had produced tens of millions of individual map sheets covering the entirety of the planned invasion area and the terrain beyond it, right down to individual hedgerows in the Norman bocage country, a landscape whose dense, high-banked field boundaries would prove murderously difficult for tank crews unfamiliar with the ground. These were not vague regional charts. They were detailed 1 to 25,000 scale sheets, showing gradients steep enough to stall a tank, showing which farm tracks could bear the weight of a Sherman and which would collapse into mud, showing exactly where German defensive positions had been photographed and plotted from repeated reconnaissance flights. Production facilities in Washington and in field printing units attached to Army groups operated around the clock, using offset lithography to churn out map sheets by the million, updated continuously as new photographic intelligence arrived. Where a German unit might receive a single outdated map for an entire campaign, an American infantry regiment could expect updated sheets reflecting reconnaissance flown within the preceding fortnight, sometimes within days, an advantage that compounded with every mile of advance. If you are finding this interesting so far, a quick subscribe helps more than you know, and there's a great deal more to the story still to come. The practical effect of this apparatus became apparent almost immediately after the Normandy landings, though not always to America's advantage in the short term, because good maps do not automatically translate into good decisions. The bocage fighting in the weeks after D-Day demonstrated both the value and the limits of the intelligence, as commanders possessed detailed knowledge of the terrain's difficulty yet still had to solve. Through improvisation, the tactical problem of infantry and armor cooperation in close country eventually resolved through field expedients like the hedgerow-cutting devices welded onto Sherman tanks. But as the campaign moved into more open terrain through the late summer of 1944, the cumulative advantage of superior mapping became undeniable. American commanders could plan artillery barrages against precisely surveyed coordinates. Armored columns could be routed around terrain features that German maps simply did not record accurately. Engineers could predict, with a fair degree of confidence, which river crossings would support pontoon bridging and which would not. The Ardennes offensive of December 1944 provides perhaps the starkest illustration of the gap. German planning for what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge relied on maps that, while adequate for the region's major roads, badly underestimated how quickly winter conditions and traffic congestion would degrade the secondary routes that the offensive's timetable depended upon. German armored columns, particularly in the northern sector where the assault ground to a halt around Elsenborn Ridge, found themselves funneled onto roads whose capacity had been overestimated, creating traffic jams of catastrophic scale precisely when speed was most essential to the operation's success. American units defending the same ground, despite being outnumbered and initially caught by surprise, were working from far more accurate terrain data, allowing scattered defensive positions to make maximum use of choke points, ridgelines, and river crossings that German planners had not adequately accounted for. It would be an overstatement to claim maps alone halted the German offensive. Fuel shortages, stubborn American resistance at road junctions like Bastogne and St. Vith, and eventually clearing weather that allowed Allied air power back into the fight all played their part, and it is important to be honest that some of the credit historians assign to superior American terrain intelligence in this campaign remains difficult to disentangle from these other factors, since surviving records do not always specify which decisions were driven by map data as opposed to simple battlefield reconnaissance or radio intercepts. What can be said with confidence is that American commanders at every level, from Army Group headquarters down to battalion command posts, had access to terrain intelligence products the German side simply could not match, and German after-action reports from the period repeatedly complain about inadequate maps contributing to logistical chaos on roads that proved narrower, softer, or more easily blocked than expected. The comparison with German cartographic efforts is instructive precisely because the Wehrmacht was not lacking in technical competence. German cartographers and survey units were skilled, and German optical and photographic equipment was, in some respects, superior to Allied equivalents early in the war. What Germany lacked was industrial scale and resource priority. German aerial reconnaissance assets were increasingly stretched thin from 1943 onward as Allied air superiority made reconnaissance flights costlier and rarer, while fuel shortages limited the sorties that could be flown at all. The printing and distribution infrastructure needed to turn photographic intelligence into usable field maps. Robust in America's case precisely because it drew on a country with enormous surplus industrial capacity, untouched by enemy bombing, simply could not be replicated by Germany fighting a two-front war with its cities under sustained aerial attack. The Soviet Union, by contrast, developed its own formidable mapping tradition, one that, in some technical respects, rivaled or exceeded American cartography, particularly in the sheer comprehensiveness of Soviet military maps, which would go on to cover the globe in extraordinary detail throughout the Cold War. But Soviet mapping in 1944 and 1945 served a different operational philosophy, one less concerned with the kind of precision terrain analysis that supported small unit maneuver and more focused on supporting the enormous, deliberately planned offensives characteristic of Red Army operations, where overwhelming mass could absorb the friction that inadequate local knowledge might otherwise cause. The legacy of this wartime mapping effort extended far beyond 1945. The techniques refined by the Army Map Service, particularly in photogrammetric analysis and rapid reproduction of terrain intelligence, became foundational to Cold War military cartography and, eventually, to the satellite imagery and geospatial intelligence systems that underpin modern warfare. It is not an exaggeration to say that the origins of contemporary military GPS and satellite reconnaissance can be traced in a direct institutional line back to the wartime recognition that knowing the ground, precisely and quickly, was as decisive a factor in modern combat as any weapon system. The psychological effect on German officers, several of whose post-war memoirs and interrogation records reflect a grudging respect for the sophistication of American terrain intelligence, should not be understated either, though such retrospective accounts must always be treated with some caution, given the tendency of defeated commanders to rationalize failure through reference to material or informational disadvantage rather than tactical error. Surviving examples of this cartographic effort can still be viewed today in the collections of the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, and in the map libraries of institutions such as the Imperial War Museum, where original 1 to 25,000 sheets from the Normandy and Ardennes campaigns preserve, in faded ink and grease pencil annotation, the precise texture of a landscape that has in many cases changed beyond recognition in the 80 years since. Return for a moment to that German officer crouched by torchlight over a captured American map somewhere in the frozen Ardennes. He is not looking at a weapon in any conventional sense. There is no explosive charge, no armor plate, no engine, and yet what he holds in his hands represents thousands of hours of aerial photography, a chain of production stretching from reconnaissance pilots risking anti-aircraft fire over enemy lines to technicians hunched over stereoscopes in Washington.